Welcome to CIHT Podcasts.
Welcome to this podcast brought to you by CIHT. We are looking at how the United Nations delivers inclusive social development. We will explore what the UN's Sustainable Development Goals mean for disability inclusive transport around the world. I'm delighted to be speaking with Daniela Bas, the Director at the Division for Inclusive Social Development at the United Nations. I'm your host, Justin Ward. Welcome, Daniela.
Good morning, good afternoon, depending on which parts of the world are listening to us, right?
Yeah, so I'm speaking from London and you're in New York right now, is that right?
Right. Yes, it is, correct.
Welcome today. The United Nations has set the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. And so which ones are the key focus for your division?
All right. So the Division for Inclusive Social Development is in the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs. And the department, through this division, is the focal point globally for the whole UN system on aging, on youth, on persons with disabilities, on indigenous peoples, and issues such as the family and cooperatives that are social enterprises. And since a couple of years, we also have in our portfolio sport. And sport, as you know, is also in the preamble of the 2030 agenda with its 17 SDGs as an enabler of development and peace. Why did I mention all of these social groups, issues, and themes? Because this already gives an idea that actually what we do in this division for the department touches most of the goals, of the 17 goals. Just to give you some quick examples, if we think of the 2030 agenda and its 17 goals, and for instance, persons with indigenous people, definitely it is in the indicators and the targets of SDG 2 and 4. So 2 is nutrition and food, and 4 is education. When it comes to, for instance, youth, although, it touches Goal 1, eradication of poverty, Goal 2, nutrition, Goal 3, health, 4, education, 5, gender, 6, etc. So for youth, we have a Goal 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, 10, 11, 12, 13, 16, 17. If we think of the SDGs related to older persons and the targets in each, in Goal 1, poverty, there are targets there related to older people, and then it's Goal 2, 3, 4, 5, 8, 10, 11, 13, 16, and 17. And if we think of persons with disabilities, they are explicitly mentioned in the goals and also in the targets of Goal 4, 8, 10, 11, 17. So I would say that when it comes then to sport for development and peace, since it is in the preamble of the agenda, it touches all 17 goals, all dimensions, social, economic, environmental, cultural, and political, as well as the 3 pillars of the United Nations: peace and security, human rights, and development. This is my answer.
And universal design is a concept that features heavily in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. For those who are not familiar with the concept, can you explain what universal design is all about?
Sure. Well, universal design, it means that an environment, be that it is buildings or facilities, products, programs, services, in that environment, family environment, employment, working environment, where you study, and so on and so forth. So whatever environments we're talking about, parks, etc., is designed to the greatest extent possible for all people, regardless of their age, of their gender, of their abilities. So it has to be applied to all aspects of development, from technology to housing, transportation, and then also natural and man-made disasters. And here I'm talking about disasters such as a flood. So that's a natural disaster. So we have to be able to apply a design that responds to the humanitarian responses required, or to disaster risk reduction, or when unfortunately there are conflicts and then we have to rebuild places, then we have to think them in terms of designing in such a way that everybody is included. So it has to be universal. We can't exclude people out of our design, and therefore we have to build by keeping in mind that whatever we design, if it has to be a good design, it is a good design because it takes into account the diverse needs and abilities of all persons throughout the design process. You see, it is a human-centered design with everyone in mind. I'll give you an example. Adopting universal design in public transit means ensuring that all entry service points are accessible, are usable, such as using low-floor transit vehicles in the rail, tram and buses. And then there are many other examples I could mention, but I would like to say whoever has a temporary reduced mobility due to sensory reasons or cognitive needs or else, or whoever has a permanent reduced mobility, even allergies should be considered because they are reducing our mobility as tourists, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or if a woman is at the latest stages of her pregnancy, she might have some reduced mobility temporarily. But there are also people who, like me, for instance, use a wheelchair. I'm paraplegic since the age of 6 years. And so for me, my reduced mobility is permanent. But then we are aging. The world is aging. The world is aging fast. The only continent right now that is not aging, but actually we still have lots of young population for the next few decades, is Africa. The world is aging. So when it comes to design, universal design, we have to keep in mind also that the new needs of the world that we are facing ahead of us.
So it's future-proofing our collective humanity, really.
Yes, exactly. Right. And when it comes to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, for instance, we believe that this convention is not only for persons with disabilities. Actually, thanks to persons with disabilities, if the convention and universal design, as it is suggested in many articles of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, are implemented, we are really preparing a world that is welcoming all people and is facilitating and providing and giving answers to the needs of all the population.
Yeah, it's a fascinating topic. You mentioned sport earlier, and I went to an exhibition at the Wellcome Trust in London, and the theme of the exhibition was on play and the importance of play. And one of the aspects of that was in a refugee camp, it made sure that there was space for children to play. It's so fundamental and so necessary, but maybe not always thought about in terms of just the immediate humanitarian response to refugees, that actually creating a space for children to play is important. And that, for me, is part of sort of the thinking of universal design. It's thinking out all the types of people and environments that you make it an environment that's good for them, that gives them opportunities.
Thank you for touching this very quickly. I would like to say that when we say sport for all, sport for peace and development, we make reference to the definition of sport of the Kazan Action Plan of 2017, which is, it's sport meant, as you said, not only for athletes or of athletes, but actually it's physical movement, it's dance, it's games, it's casual sport. It's not just the traditional way we think of sport. Otherwise, it doesn't include all people. And what you said is an amazing example, particularly if we think of places where there are either refugees or where there have been conflicts and there are mines. And even when the conflict is over, there are still mines, unfortunately, where people can step on and acquire a disability. And so isn't that amazing to make sure that also those areas, from those areas, we remove all those weapons and mines and whatever, so that people and kids can play safely, right? And that's again another way of making sure that our universe is accessible to all people in an affordable manner and safety.
And how much progress have we seen with the implementation of universal design around the world? I mean, is it an established norm for good design? And if not, what more do you think could be done to embed its principles among highway and other professionals?
Right. Well, I have to say that, universal design is suggested. It cannot be imposed. Each country then decides which policies wants to apply in terms of universal design and so on. However, we do have some good examples. We have seen some good progress around the world. Norway, for instance, as part of their national transport plan, Norway has been upgrading 473 bus stops and 26 traffic hubs to confirm the principles of universal design. And so Norway made universal design of ICT as a legal requirement for both public and the private sector. Another one, Australia. Australia is increasing community awareness of universal design through their national disability strategies. It's a decade from 2010 until next year. And in 2010, the ACT government delivered over 300 new properties that met the principles of universal design. And China, the Housing Authority, has adopted universal design principles in public housing developments since 2002. And to facilitate movement of all people, including persons with disabilities, within the estate, the Housing Authority in China has provided barrier-free access route and tactile guide paths connecting domestic blocks to major estate facilities, such as, for instance, transportation nodes, commercial, welfare, community facilities, and so on. So even though we see that there are good practices of universal design, I believe that there are still exceptions rather than the norm. And I think that the best strategy is to first introduce the concept of accessibility. What does it mean? Okay? And as a more resource, and more resources we have available, the easier it will be to raise the standards and attain a higher level of universal design. Because we need to shift, I believe, our collective mindset from seeing accessible transportation, for instance, as a costly exercise, as a charitable effort, but as a smart investment in infrastructure and community development. As I said, keeping in mind that the world from a demographic viewpoint is changing.
And what can be done to ensure that governments don't just sign the convention as a tick box exercise? For example, what steps can be taken to enforce and monitor improvements? And does the UN highlight good practice or name and shame offenders?
Well, as United Nations, we cannot enforce anything, but what we can do is to provide good examples, and then it's up to countries and governments to decide how they want to implement and enforce at national level the suggestions and the policies and practices that exist in other places or that have been decided here by member states when they meet here at the United Nations and they decided to ratify, for instance, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Then it is up to those countries to enforce whatever they have decided and accepted here at national level. However, I believe that the more disaggregated data we have on the various needs of the population, the easier it might be for policymakers as well as for the all these stakeholders, if they do have disaggregated data, it might be easier then to see the need to apply the convention and the universal design and many other things that we already have in place to make sure that the life of all people, be that they have reduced mobility, temporary mobility, permanent reduced mobility or so, be that they have a disability or they're older and sometimes becoming old, it implies that we acquire some kind of disabling conditions or else. So by doing this, by demonstrating with data, not only with goodwill, how many people billions of people would benefit of the implementation of the Convention, Universal Design, the 17 goals of the 2030 Agenda, etc., in order not to leave anyone behind, then probably that will be what triggers in governments the need to do what needs to be done in order to serve the people we're here for. We're here to serve the people. Governments are there to serve the people, and the people are us, all of us, be that we are in a governmental position or not. We are part of the people. So this is the answer I can give you. The UN, you see, encourages, doesn't push shame. The role of the UN is to offer the space for countries to exchange good practices and to highlight good examples of what each country is doing, and this is what we hope to achieve.
You mentioned the developments in universities. So can we focus on training a little bit? Because in terms of particularly universal and inclusive design, is it feasible to establish a common curriculum for professionals that would be a sort of non-negotiable condition of qualification in their chosen profession? And if so, is that an initiative that is within the UN scope?
I believe it would be very important actually to raise awareness. And by raising awareness, if we could rethink some training curricula and have some common denominators that apply to all curricula, that would be helpful. Each country has different needs and different requirements when it comes to universal design, for instance, okay? If a person lives in a country where there are mountains and minus 20 grades centigrade, universal design definitely has the different requirements than if we design roads or infrastructures or whatever, or we provide services and products in countries where the temperatures can be very high. Just to give you two silly examples, or if one lives in the mountains and one lives nearby the sea, I mean, the requirements are different. However, there are some basic requirements that should be part of all curricula, and I believe that maybe this could be an interesting challenge that we want to bring here at the United Nations, give the space, and have a conversation around it.
Thank you for listening. That was an interview with Daniela Bas, the Director at the Division for Inclusive Social Development at the United Nations. If you're interested in this topic, I would recommend listening to other CIHT podcasts, Making Transport Inclusive Globally with Charlotte McLean-Nelapo from the World Bank, and Improving the Lives of People with Disabilities with Anne Fry. Thanks again for listening.